Some passages of Scripture are helpful for us, even if we don't know exactly where they came from or how they came to exist. We might even ask why they came to exist. Yet the why in this case, in Matthew 4, gets answered rather quickly. When Jesus faced his temptations in our gospel lesson today, he gave us an example to follow. There's the why right off the bat. Standing up to temptation isn't something we can truly or fully achieve. We all will fall short. Yet this is aspirational. We try to follow the model that Jesus sets before us, knowing that we will all fall short and we don't always achieve that goal. Sometimes we can be strong. We don't always fall to the temptation. Sometimes we overcome them. Sometimes we can be the bigger person. We can find those words of hope when we want to respond with something else. Sometimes that temptation to do nothing can be overcome with that action that is helpful. But we also, when we think about temptations, recognize that they're not universal. Things that tempt you might not be anything for someone else. And what's a huge issue for one person, for someone else, might not be anything for you. In the face of all our temptations, Jesus shows us how to live. Jesus shows us how to respond. Astute readers of the Old Testament may have already noted the lack of prophecies about the Messiah needing to face temptations. And if you were thinking that already, congratulations, because that's a really good insight and reflects some tight knowledge of your Old Testament prophecies. The reason you were thinking that is because there's nothing in the Jewish tradition that suggested the Messiah was going to have to face a temptation. They weren't expecting temptations to be part of the Messiah's story. Biblical scholars note that this story, though, appears in both Mark and that lost ancient source we know as Q. Now, the Gospels, Matthew and Luke, both had access to Mark and Q. And the interesting thing in all three of these Gospels, which we know as the Synoptic Gospels, is that this story is in all three. So it had to be important. There's a reason that Matthew, Mark, and Luke have this story. Now, in Mark, it's not a moral test. It's more of a test of strength, and there's no conversation. And that's how we can tell that Matthew and Luke both had access to a different source, because both Matthew and Luke have that conversation, the dialogue back and forth. And they're very similar. In some ways, they're verbatim with one another, except Luke mixes up the order a little bit for his own theological emphasis. But the consistency of this story in these three Gospels shows us the significance it held for early Christ followers. They faced temptations. We face temptations. The question is, what do we do about it? These can be large or small, but in each case, the temptation threatens to come between us and God. That's the nature of it. Giving in to temptations leads to sin. And sin is anything that separates us from God. Whether this is something that's big, like complicity and dehumanizing actions against other people, and we've talked about that in recent weeks, or it's big like systemic oppression or destroying God's creation. Or the temptation could be small, like the gluttony of having that extra piece of pie. Is that sinful? The body's a temple? I don't know. But the point is, temptations are all around us. And when we give in to those temptations, That's what leads to sin. And that's why this story is so important. That's why it was so important to the early church. They wanted something to show us what to do in the face of the things we encounter. Not every this story wasn't about some hypothetical test either, something that we couldn't do, like turning stones into bread. But this, and the idea of temptation, is personal. It's about the things that really confront us, the real temptations. Do we power through, white-knuckling it, willing our spirit to do the right thing? In Matthew 4, Jesus gives us a different path. Jesus provides a different answer. The passage is very clear why he went into the wilderness. It says he went to be tempted. That's why he was there. He was facing what we cannot face. He demonstrated a capacity to stand when we cannot stand. In the case of his first temptation, he was facing a physical need. It began by describing his fast. He had already been fasting and praying. So the tempter said, "Turn these stones into bread." And Jesus responded, not with some sort of depth of personal stamina and self-control, this enormous willpower. He quoted Scripture. He quoted Deuteronomy chapter 8, verse 3, "One cannot live by bread alone." When facing his real temptation, something he could and probably wanted to do, Jesus didn't respond in the moment. He did not have to come up with some off-the-cuff answer to something that was really confronting him. He was prepared. What about us? Are we? Are we ready when that same version of a temptation, something that is real to us, comes across our path? Are we prepared? Jesus had spent time preparing for this. He began not just fasting for the sake of fasting. He had been praying. When the real temptation came knocking, he had been spending time in deep prayer. He knew Scripture backward and forward. He had been studying it his entire life. And so when we see these two things together, they gave him the tools he needed for what he encountered. Even though he was really hungry, really hungry. I don't know, has anybody ever fasted as a part of a spiritual retreat, exercise? Not many. Try it. As long as it doesn't do anything with health or any other issues, try it. It's an amazing experience. He was really hungry, and yet that time invested in prayer and studying Scripture was paying dividends. He knew the answer. He knew what to say. He knew what to do. When facing this physical need, his time in prayer had attuned his spirit to God's will, God's voice, God's desire for our lives. His time studying Scripture gave him an answer. He didn't have to pick up the Bible and then try to zoom it in because he forgot his readers. I don't know if anybody's ever done that, tried to zoom on a paper page. It doesn't work. He knew the verses. He could go, Deuteronomy 8:3 tells us one does not live by bread alone. He could have quoted Tim Rice, the lyricist for Jesus Christ Superstar, and said, I could turn these stones into bread. I could do it on my head. But if he had chosen to go the route of quoting a 1970s rock opera, he would have added at the end of that, but I'm not going to. I don't need to, though, because God will provide. And that's the story in Deuteronomy. That's the story in Scripture. That's part of getting into this whole corpus of God's work and revelation and understanding what the nature of God is. This addendum comes from his faith formed in prayer and Scripture. And that's where our faith, if we're being honest, so often falls short. We encounter temptations, and instead of being more like Jesus in Matthew 4 and in Mark and in Luke, we start to sound more like Eve in Genesis 3. We lean on our understanding. That idea, I can do this. I can just power through. In Genesis 3, it says the serpent was craftier than any of the other creatures. The Hebrew word there, nakshah, it means snake or serpent. It comes from the sound they make. That's the etymology of that word. It's not referencing the diablo, the Greek word diablo in Matthew 4, or even the shaitan of the book of Job. So we could say, well, what is this snake or the devil or Satan? Matthew reflected so much of the time and the culture and the context. There's actually not part of the story figuring out who this was. See, my favorite example of a tempter comes from the cartoon Pogo. And it's, we have met the enemy, and the enemy is us. James 1:14 articulates this much better when it says, one is tempted by one's own evil desire, being lured and enticed by it. See, the truth is, we don't need a nakshah or snake from Genesis 3. We don't need the shaitan from Job. We don't need the devil from Matthew 4. We can do it pretty well on our own. We come up with temptations pretty well. But Eve does something more for us. In our Old Testament lesson, there's a verbal sparring with the serpent. And after hearing the case from the snake, the fruit looked good. It was a delight to the eye. It could make one wise. She took it and ate it. When we read this and we contrast Genesis 3 with Matthew 4, we find that we're so much more like Eve than Jesus. We can contrast her experience with how Jesus responded and then add in our own experience with temptation. It's easy to blame Eve. History hasn't been kind to her. For example, St. Augustine wrote, though through a woman came death, Eve, ruin. It was contrasting Eve and Mary. And he doesn't give us vocal inflection in his Latin. But the idea is essentially to blame Eve for sin in the garden. And that's not fair to Eve. Everything was so new. God didn't do anything wrong. God told her and Adam not to eat off the tree. But we have some serious advantages over her. And we have the example of Jesus. We don't need to join the chorus blaming Eve for sin. James points out that we do a pretty good job finding sin on our own. Instead, we can thank God for her example and look at how we can learn from that, learn from the gospel, and then respond to our temptations in a new way. At this point, we could run down the rabbit hole the wrong way because these concepts, they introduce ideas like the snake or shaitan or Satan or diablo or devil can lead us in the wrong direction and provide fodder for letting ourselves off the hook. The devil made me do it. If we're going along doing life and just trying to do the best we can, and there's some power in opposition to God out there always trying to trip us up and tempt us and lead us in another direction, it sort of takes all of the agency away from us. Instead, it says here in Matthew that there is another approach. Jesus shows us what to do. Pray. Pray. That's why I mentioned fasting a little while ago. There's nothing to attune our spirit quite like that. When we're intentionally doing something that takes us out of our comfort zone and places us in a different context with a focus on prayer. But we don't have to just pray once on a retreat, once while fasting, or occasionally when we join our voices together in worship with the Lord's Prayer. We can talk to God every single day. And that's what Jesus was demonstrating. This sacred attunement with the Spirit. Studying our Bibles is another path. Studying the Bible, joining a small group where we can learn and unlock passages together, opening Scripture on a daily basis. If you ever are wondering where to start, ask. I'm happy to make suggestions. It won't always be the same. I mean, some days I may say, read Ephesians a bunch of times in a row and see what it says to you each time. It'll be different. Read James a bunch of times in a row. Every time it will say something different. Matthew 5, I could go on, but studying Scripture helps us prepare for whatever we encounter. But the thing is, in Matthew, Jesus doesn't leave it there. And that's where we come in and we come together. See, right after this, Jesus went and he called his first disciples. Yes, he went off on a retreat. Yes, he was praying by himself. Yes, he was studying Scripture. But right after this, he demonstrated that most essential part of our response to the temptations we encounter in our lives, and that is community. It's you, it's me, it's us together as a church family, lifting one another up, encouraging one another. Just after this is when he called Peter and Andrew and James and John, and he went on from there, building up what became the source for these gospels that we now have, that early church. And this is the part in the story where we continue today. Because we don't face our temptations alone. We face everything that we encounter together as a part of God's family, as a part of this family of faith. And so we can pray. We can study God's holy word. We can lift one another up as we seek to stand up before the temptations we encounter in this world. And this Lenten journey, we add things instead of giving them up. We add kindness, we add helping, we add hope, and we add so many more. Be open to what God says to you. Be open to where God leads you, and stand strong whenever you encounter the tempter.